I'll just kind of present a little bit of the background of the research and kind of the methodology and what we found, and hopefully that will be a really good segue into the actual panel discussion. So just to give you a little bit of the background, this study focused on the question of whether discrimination is within the hiring process is an issue of the past or whether it still is something that we need to worry about today. So we are following up on this study from an original study that Phil Oriopoulos conducted in 2011. And in that study, he sent out over 12,000, nearly 13,000 resumes to over 3,000 job postings. And these are fake resumes, so resumes that have been standardized so that the only thing that's different within them is the name. And then they were sent to these real job postings, and all of the job postings required a BA. So they were fairly high-skilled job postings. So from this study, we focused on the difference between Anglo-Canadian job applicant names versus those with Asian names. The importance of this study is really the fact that within an audit study like this, you can really pick up on employers engaging in what we call direct discrimination. Now, when we say direct discrimination, this doesn't necessarily imply that this is explicit or conscious discrimination. It may be, or on the other hand, it may be based on implicit bias. But nonetheless, it is very clear that certain people got callbacks more than others. So we looked at whether applicants with Indian, Pakistani, or Chinese names had different callback rates relative to Anglo-named applicants. So the original study that Philip Oriopoulos did in 2011 looked at this issue, and in fact found that those with Asian-sounding names had a 30% less callback rate than those with Anglo-sounding names, even when the resumes had Canadian education, Canadian experience, and Canadian credentials altogether. So we kind of wanted to follow up on this and examine whether the issue of discrimination in the hiring process differs by employer characteristics. So specifically, we were interested in whether larger employers had more fair hiring processes. Also, we wanted to focus on whether the type of job that was being posted played a role in the kinds of biases that we see. And specifically, employer size may be important because it can really be a marker of the sophistication of the HR processes that are in place. So we gathered additional information on the data that Phil Oriopoulos collected back in 2008 and 2009. We collected information on employer size. We looked at large employers, those with 500 people or more, medium employers, 50 to 500, and small employers, 50 employees or less. What we found, actually before I get to what we found, the reason why we really wanted to look at this issue of large versus smaller employers is that, larger employers, as you can imagine, can devote more resources to the recruitment process. They have more people working in their HR department. Many smaller employers, of course, don't even have an HR department. They often have more of a standardized and professionalized recruitment experience, and often they also have more racial diversities within the organization to begin with. So they have more experience with diversity. So, in terms of what we found, these graphics, I think, really illustrate the differences very clearly. So for Anglo-named applicants, all the qualifications, of course, were Canadian education and Canadian experience. Within the Asian-named applicants, those with Chinese, Indian, or Pakistani names, the sample was further divided into those with purely Canadian credentials and those with some foreign credentials. And what we found is that Asian-named applicants with purely Canadian credentials had a 32% lower callback rate than those with Anglo-named applicants. For those who had foreign credentials of any kind, so education and or experience, this lower callback rate was actually at 53%. So when you looked at this by employer size, some really striking differences really showed up. What we actually found is that larger employers indeed do exhibit less bias within the hiring process. So within larger employers, applicants with Asian names but Canadian credentials had about a 20% lower callback rate. But within smaller employers, this was closer to 40%. So small and medium-sized employers had about double the bias, you could say, in the callback rate relative to larger employers. Now, when you look at the foreign-trained Asian named applicants, this difference really stands out. Smaller employers tend to have a much lower callback rate for Asian named applicants with any kind of foreign credentials. Another issue that we looked at, as I said, was the job skill level. So we hypothesized that jobs that were high-skilled probably had more emphasis put on their credentials and educational background. So we wanted to see whether the Asian name as well as the foreign education and experience played a role in, within the skill level. What we found is that indeed it does. It's within the high-skilled job postings that you really find a marked difference in the foreign credential, foreign educated Asian named applicants. So I should stress here that at every skill level, Asian named applicants had lower callback rates. So it wasn't that at low skilled level there was no disadvantage, there was. But it's really at the high skill levels that you really see an even bigger level of disadvantage for the Asian named applicants. So when you divide this up by larger versus small and medium-sized employers, you can really see that it's the smaller employers at the high-skilled jobs that really don't seem to have the resources in place to evaluate foreign credentials. So the high-skilled jobs presumably are the jobs where you need to really evaluate the credentials and educational background. And it's at those jobs that you see a much larger disadvantage for smaller and medium-sized employers. But again, it should be stressed that at every size of employer and at every skill level, that level of disadvantage for Asian named applicants does remain. So this one shows for lower skilled levels. So you can see how, so I'll go back to the high skill level, and you can see that at the high skill level, Asian named applicants with foreign qualifications had a 68% lower callback rate. At the low skilled level, this was only 58% lower. So you can really see that it's the high-skilled jobs that they face even greater disadvantage, particularly for smaller employers. So another issue that we actually explored is whether having additional qualifications, Canadian master's level qualifications, kind of overcomes some of the disadvantage that Asian named applicants perhaps face. So maybe by getting a Canadian degree, higher level degree, Asian named applicants can actually overcome their disadvantage. So we explored this issue by comparing Asian named applicants with an MA degree versus Anglo named applicants without an MA degree. And we actually found that even in those cases, Asian named applicants with a Canadian master's degree were less likely to be called back than Anglo named applicants without a master's degree. And you can really see that this is sort of the worst for foreign-trained or educated professionals. So this last slide here really emphasizes how much size of employer matters. For the larger employers, for Canadian trained applicants who had an Asian name, having that Canadian extra master's degree actually gave them a slight benefit. But when you look at the smaller employers, even having that master's degree did not help them. So this really emphasized that, you know, although a lot of Canadian racial minorities may try to pursue higher education to try and overcome the disadvantage they face, it may not help them depending on the size and type of employer they're applying to. So what does this all mean? Well, first of all, we want to emphasize that both large and small employers exhibit discriminatory hiring practices. So that being said, this discriminatory hiring practices may or may not be the result of explicit discrimination. It may very well be based on implicit bias. Large organizations seem to be more receptive to Asian named applicants, and particularly at the highest level skilled jobs, you can see the biases really shine through. So for larger organizations, we think that devoting more resources to the evaluation of applicants, having more knowledge-based and standardized human resource practices really does help them in overcoming some of those biases. In addition, we know that larger employers tend to have more experience with diversity, therefore more experience with diverse names, and this tends to kind of help them. That being said, the unobservable decisions that are made by individuals, even in large employers, do tend to lead to bias in the end. For small employers, this is very important. So we find that small employers, who are often themselves disadvantaged because of their lack of resources, are actually suffering because they are not necessarily responding to the most talented applicants. So often they lack modern HR practices, they lack professional recruitment expertise, and this kind of lack of experience with diversity and awareness of the possibility of bias really is holding them back from getting the best applicants. So why is this important? Well, this type of discrimination is hidden and invisible. People don't even know if they are not getting a call back because of their name. It's not something that someone can actually be confidently aware of. It's quite widespread. So as we said, large employers, small employers, high-skilled, low-skilled, all of them do, to some extent or other, show bias towards Asian-named applicants. And it's extremely significant because it is the first stage in the ability to get a good job. So if you can't even get your foot into the door to get an interview, you can't make it in anywhere within the organization. So it's also really important to note that this is only the one stage where discrimination may be playing a role. So this type of discrimination might be compounded within other stages of the career process, such as promotions and wages. And this disadvantages not only the minority job seekers themselves, but also employers, and particularly small employers. So that's why we think that this forum is extremely important. It's really important for us to have a conversation about this, to bring this to light and really talk about it and make not only the public but also employers really aware that this is an issue that affects them and actually disadvantages them.